Today, we'll talk about Chapter 7, Adjacency Pairs and Preference. And before we do that, let me go through what we have done last time on turn-taking. Before you read your materials, I'd like you to think about these issues and try to write down what you know about this question. So the question was, what question does turn-taking system is organized to address? So a turn-taking system was developed to explain something, and I'd like you to know what that something is and put that down following in number 2. What I remember about turn-taking includes that it shows and provides an example, and you think about why turn-taking is important in CA. So some clue to this question is presented in this slide. So the number 1 turn-taking mechanism is designed to explain, and there are some key concepts, and then the turn allocations and why it is important. Now, today's lesson is what's called adjacency pair and preference. And before you read this chapter, I'd like you to think about this question. Suppose that you are an expert in media interview and you were asked to explain the following excerpt 34. So what information can you offer to the laypersons? So this data is from U.S. media, interview done by Charlie Gibson from ABC News, and vice presidential candidate for 2008 elections, Sarah Palin from Alaska. And here's the question that was presented in the chapter. So Charlie Gibson says this is very early part of the interview, and that because of this interview, Sarah Palin was criticized for her performance in this interview. So our task is to explain what happens in the data using CA approach that other approach can't explain. So Gibson says, do you agree with the Bush doctrine? And then a pause. And Palin says, in what respect, Charlie? And then another pause. And then Gibson rephrased the question. Bush, what do you interpret to be? And then a micro pause. And then Palin says his worldview. And then Gibson says, no, the Bush doctrine enunciated September 2002 for Iraq war. And then Palin says, I believe that. So at the end of the day, when you listen to this lecture and read the material, then I hope that you'll be able to analyze this data. And another set of data I'd like you to think about is from a ESL classroom interaction between native teachers and non-native students at a university setting in the US. So same question, teacher and students' response. And this is much more complicated than the previous data, but if you know well about adjacency pair and the preference, you'll be able to answer this question. So this will be the goal for today's lessons. After reading and understanding what's presented in the content, then you'll be able to analyze these two sets of data. As I noted before, I'd like us to go through some passages to help you with the content. This is page 59. And the title is Adjacency Pairs and Preference. Let me select few passages to go through with you, and then in the second line, adjacency pair consists of two utterances positioned adjacent to each other, which is the reason, therefore, the phenomena has been so named. So adjacency pair is a pair that is located close to each other. And if you go to a second paragraph, or notable features of adjacency pair is that if the first pair part of some pair, like greeting, is produced, its second pair part strongly expected. So, for example, if you say hi as a greeting, your interlocutor has to respond in some way, hi or how are you and so on. So when the first part, which is called the first pair part, is produced, the second pair part is strongly expected. So for example, if you say hi, and when the other person doesn't answer, it's pretty noticeable thing. So the example is in line in 28. Now, I just gave you an example of hi, how are you? And then hi, and then not responding. So you can see that the second pair part, not all second pair part are treated equal. In other words, some are preferred, others are not. So that's described in the later part in here. Not all second pair parts are, however, treated equally in conversational interactions. Some SPPs are preferred over others, and this preference structure offers interpretive resources to participants and analysts alike for figuring out how participants interpret each other's turn at talk. So, since the second pair part is treated differently, analysts, researchers like us, or participants also use that response and try to understand how people respond to each other. So if you turn to the next page, so let's look at excerpt 29 and the 30s. Excerpt 29, child says, could you put on the light for my room? And then father says, yep. So second pair part is produced pretty quickly. But if you look at excerpt 30, it's probably the professors and the student. I wondered if there's any chance of seeing you tomorrow, sometime morning or before this seminar. And then you have 1 second pause. And then R says, I doubt it. And the reason is I'm seeing Elizabeth. So if you compare that, the second pair part in excerpt 29 is produced right away, whereas second pair part in 30 is produced after the delay. And then also it is followed by some explanations about why this person couldn't see this person next day. So if you look at the line here, whereas preferred SPPs are routinely produced with no delay or gap and are therefore unmarked structurally, the preferred SPPs are structurally marked by displays of delay, for example, by the speaker using particles like this alongside mitigating phrases. So it's structural notion. It's not a psychological notion. If it's a psychological notion, we have to think about what people feel about this conversation, and we have no access to their mind. But structurally, meaning if you look at how the texts are produced, we can easily see that preferred response and dispreferred response are produced differently, as noted here. Dispreferred second pair part are produced with the delay and then reasons and some particles, and so on and so on. So that's what we mean by structurally. You can easily see how these two different second pair parts are produced. So this is how adjacency pair and preference are related. So if you look at page 61, there are a list of all kinds of adjacency pair we are familiar with. For example, recast, invite, offer, invite, assess, question, blame, and so on. So for example, if somebody recasts something, granting that request is preferred. This preferred is refusal would be this preferred. So if you are refusing some request, then your second pair part will be it'll come with a delay or particles or explanations for the refusals and so on. So later in the text here, in line here, preference structure, however, is not always clear-cut because it often contains some conflicting orientation. The poemers noted that preference structure is not always clear-cut. For example, if somebody praised someone else, then the person who got praise has to determine whether he is going to agree with the praise or he has to sort of downgrade his own compliment. For example, if somebody says to you, you did a very good job, and then if you agreed, then you would say, yes, I did. But then that maybe sounds very awkward because you're praising yourself. So praising and then compliment has sort of conflicting interest. So there are some ways for the participants to downgrade and mitigate this conflicting interest. So the example is 32 and 33. I think you could understand what that means if you read it. Now, this is sort of like a basic technological technique in CA in terms of adjacency pair and how first pair part and second pair part are treated unequally in conversation. And that happens all the time in conversational exchange. Now, these types of this preference structure in adjacency pair are also noted in all kinds of professional setting. And this chapter provides two examples. One is from a media interview, and the other one is from educational setting. So this one that we have seen at the outset of this presentation between Sarah Pauline and Charlie Gibson from ABC News. So let's take a look at this data. And I'm going to read in the second second paragraph in the page. When Charlie Gibson asked, "Do you agree with the Bush doctrine?" and then Pauline remained silent for a while, as can be seen in line 2. This is a mark of this preferred second pair part form. So question was produced, but then answer was not produced right away, after the delay. One can make some inference as to why this was the case. After the delay, Pauline decided to ask a question herself in line 3, and thus initiated another agency pair. So in other words, instead of answering the question, Pauline asked another question, which is to say, rather than producing second pair part, Pauline initiates another adjacency pair. So now it's Gibson who has to answer. Right? So as a result, the answer to Gibson's question was left hanging without appropriate closure. Interestingly, Gibson's answer is also delayed here in line 4. So Gibson, in line 4, produced a pause, marking the disprepared status of his answer on his part. Then he begins to rephrase the question in line 5 to 6, responding to Pauline's first pair part. So as you can see, in professional setting, in the media interview, you have interview sessions where a question was asked and the answers are produced, but then there are these preferred answers that tells us what these participants learn and interpret the other's response. For example, Gibson's pause in line 4 tells us something about what Gibson learns about Pauline's answer. Rather than answering the question, Pauline asks a question. So from a media perspective, Gibson may have thought that maybe Pauline is avoiding a difficult question, and so on. But then if you move on, later on, in line 8, Pauline asks another question, and then Gibson produced the answer to it and offering another questions and so on. So if you look at this data, you can see that the participants respond to each other, not just the content of the question, but also the manner of asking question and manner of answering question, from which people make some inferences about the knowledge, competence, and intentions, and so on about their participant. So the analysis listed in this text, so reads through, and I'd like to jump into the concluding part in in page 63. Here, the Pauline-Gibson interview is a complicated case in which one questioning sequence is embedded within another. In other words, when Charlie Gibson asks a question, then answer is due, but before producing an answer, Sarah Pauline produced another question. So Gibson has to answer to that question. So the one adjacency pair is embedded into another adjacency pair. So that's what this passage is about. Two adjacency pairs are deployed in the question Gibson initiated early on. Analytically, the relationship between these adjacency pairs is important because they are meaningfully related. Unless one adjacency pair is not addressed well, the other adjacency pair cannot be addressed. That is to say, there are a hierarchy among components of interactional exchanges in which adjacency pairs are closely tied to each other. Okay? So Pauline's question is related to Gibson's question. Unless Charlie Gibson answers Pauline's question, the bigger adjacency pair cannot be fulfilled. Right? So this is what Jefferson calls embedded side sequence. The adjacency pair is embedded in another section. So that is the example presented in 35 and excerpt in 36. If you look at the next page, here, why Jefferson presented this embedded sequence, she says, Jefferson's point in the paper is to describe a side sequence that is subsidiary to the former and major sequence. The sequence reveals the complex interactional works that participants are engaged in, that of initiating a side sequence to deal with the problem, and then once they have been resolved, resuming the former sequence. For our purpose here, note that adjacency pairs are embedded into a longer turn-taking exchange in which a question occasions a series of contingent interpretive moves by the participant to address various matters such as the assumptions embedded in the question, responses that are not expected, or any other contingent issues each turn at talk generate. So if somebody asks a question, the question may contain some assumptions and issues that needs to be solved. So if that is required, then people produce a side sequence to handle their problems before getting back to the major sequence. So if we have that understanding, then we would be able to identify what the major sequence is involved in the conversation and what are the subsidiary, supplementary sequence are, and then how they are related meaningfully and how participants negotiate with these issues in the course of interaction. When I say in the course of interaction, while they are interacting with each other, they figure these things out and solve there. That's something that conversation analysts are trying to address. Okay, let me conclude. In previous chapter, we talked about turn-taking system as a basic mechanism through which you can see how people negotiate their speakership. Today, adjacency pair and preference are similar mechanisms, very basic generic mechanisms people show when they're doing conversation. And we learned that there are some actions that are closely related, like adjacency pair. Greeting is responded with another greeting. Request is responded with a grant or refusal and so on. So they are tightly, closely tied to each other, and therefore some second pair is expected, others are not so expected, and what the second pair part is not something. It's not something that is expected, then it's called a preferred response because it shows a structural marking that shows, for example, delay or particles or providing examples and so on. So those are the resources participants use in the way they deal with each other in conversation. Okay? So that's the second technical chapter, and the next chapter will be the last technical chapter where we're going to talk about repair, how people fix their turns in the course of conversation. Okay? Thank you.